We want to take just a short session to go through some of the New Testament terms for ordination and foreordination that are interpreted by Calvinists as supporting their view of individual predestination and the idea that every single person is predestined to salvation or damnation. There are a number of different terms used in the Bible for ordination, in other words, to be selected and given a position or a place in a group. Not all of those, of course, are talking about what we call foreordination, which means to be chosen ahead of time. Some of those are just talking about someone being ordained in the moment. So at that moment, when someone laid hands on them, they were ordained, or as a decision in the moment. What we want to look at are the examples of words that are used, and we're going to start with the New Testament. There are expressions used for predestination, being predestined, or foreordination, which are effectively the same thing. That just means I'm just referring to statements that are made that are talking about someone being chosen ahead of time. And whether or not them being chosen ahead of time falls into one of the categories that we talked about in our last study, where they might be chosen for a purpose, but that doesn't mean they're chosen to be saved or destroyed, regardless of whatever their choice is. I'm not going to go through all of those again in this session, because this is just going to be a short session on some technical issues and some of the Greek. But in order to understand what the Bible actually says about the things that God foreordains, and for that matter, the things he does not foreordain that I believe Calvinists have assumed, or perhaps you might even say presumed, that he's foreordained, that fall into other categories that are not actually statements about individual predestination. Again, I want to stress what I mean by individual predestination, that's a main tenet of Calvinism, is the idea that every single person in existence was chosen long before they were born, either to be delivered and nothing could stop that, including their own choices, and that's a guarantee that they're going to be delivered, or they've been chosen to be damned and destroyed, and they are guaranteed to be damned and destroyed. There's nothing they could do to avoid that destination. Just as you might say on the flip side of the coin, those who are supposedly elected by God to receive salvation cannot do anything, or will not do anything apparently, that could cause them to lose their salvation. That's simply not what the Bible teaches, but as I've talked about in past sessions, the reason that Calvinists believe that is because they are using statements, especially in the New Testament, though there are some in the Old, that talk about God's foreordaining things. And they're applying that foreordination to individuals and saying, if God foreordains that his people are going to be saved, that must mean individual people are foreordained to be saved. But as we talked about previously, often what God's talking about when he's talking about his people being saved is the group that constitutes his people. So Israel will be saved. Well, Israel being saved doesn't mean every single Israelite's going to be saved. There are many who have rejected God's will and are lost. We'll go through all that in more detail as we go on, but before we get into examining the key scriptures in the New Testament that refer to predestination or foreordination, in order to determine whether they're talking about individual predestination to salvation or destruction, or whether they're talking about one of the other types of predestination we talked about in our last study, and I gave you a chart listing those different forms of predestination, I want to first take a moment to define the words that are used for predestination in the Bible, since we're going to need to examine the places where they're found, and some of them are translated in ways other than predestination or some synonym of foreordination. So you might miss them if you're looking for those terms in the English. You need to look at the original language to find all the examples of those words, so you make sure that you are getting all the information so you can know what the Bible has to say about those terms. I'm going to start with the Greek words in the New Testament, since that's the primary place most Calvinists begin with in order to establish their concept of the predestination of New Covenant believers. The Greek word that's used for predestination, or to predestine something, or other forms of that word, is proorizo, P-R-O-O-R-I-Z-O. It's a combination of the Greek word pro, P-R-O, that means before, and horizo, H-O-R-I-Z-O, which is one letter short of a word we have in our language, which we get from this word, the word horizon. Horizo means to mark out or to set a boundary. And so our English word horizon, which comes from it, is referring to the boundary line between what poetically we might say is the earth and the sky. Horizo, in turn, comes from the Greek word horion, which is H-O-R-I-O-N. That's the Greek term for a boundary line. The Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, what is usually referred to by scholars as Louisa, defines proorizo as meaning to come to a decision beforehand, to decide beforehand, to determine ahead of time, to decide upon ahead of time. Now, that may seem like a different definition than I just gave you of proorizo, which is what it means, to mark something out or set a boundary ahead of time. But the idea of what people think of as predestination or foreordination comes from God setting certain boundaries or appointing certain boundaries or certain things within those boundaries ahead of time. To get a little bit fuller definition of the meaning of this word, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament expands on it. It defines it as meaning to limit or to set the limit, and then figuratively to fix or to appoint something. And as an extension of that, it can mean to determine someone as something or to appoint someone as something. That's pretty important because I told you one of the ways that the Bible uses the term predestination is to predestine a person to a position or purpose. That has nothing to do with whether they're going to be saved or damned and destroyed. It's just a purpose they're filling. When God predestined that Cyrus would begin the process of releasing the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, the fact that he predestined Cyrus to do that had nothing to do with Cyrus being saved or damned by those actions. It just meant Cyrus was going to carry out his will as someone who was accomplishing the purpose God wanted to accomplish, as an agent of God's purpose. Same thing can go for a group. God can appoint a group to do that. He called Israel to fill certain roles that they have never yet completely filled, and I believe they are going to have to fulfill them one day because God predestined that they would fulfill those roles. But that's a group. And we're going to find that's pretty important when we get into the next study after this, when we start going through the passages that use the words I'm going to talk about in this study that are referring to foreordination or predestination. And you're going to find out that when it does talk about people being predestined to salvation, it is talking about a plural group being predestined, not individuals within the group, which just means if God says that he's predestined that there's going to be Gentiles in the church, there is going to be Gentiles in the church. It doesn't mean he's already predestined which specific Gentiles will and will not be. Same thing would go for the general church in terms of the fact that he is predestined that there will be a new covenant church. That doesn't mean every member of it is predestined. And you could go back further than that to Israel, that Israel, as I said, was predestined to be a nation God was going to use, and I do believe, to receive the promises that some believe they've already received, but I don't believe they've fully received yet. And if that's the case, that means that the nation of Israel as a group, is predestined, but that doesn't mean every single Israelite has already been pre-selected to either be a part of that group or out of that group. And that's going to be very important, as I said, as we look at some of these passages in the next study. This study is just going to be a short study giving you some of the key Greek words that are used for predestination and foreordination and God choosing somebody ahead of time in the New Testament. And then, as I said, next time we're going to go through and look at the places where those words are found and find out if the Bible actually uses those terms to refer to individuals being predestinated to a guarantee of salvation or a guarantee of destruction, no matter what they do, or whether he's actually talking about groups or processes or parts of his plan or people carrying out purposes, all of which would have nothing to do with individual predestination to salvation or damnation. Now, I started with this word proorizo. Before I move on to some of the other words, it's pretty interesting, considering this is the word translated as predestination or to be predestinated in the Bible. And given the amount of attention that Calvinists give to those terms, you might find it interesting to know, if you don't know it already, that proorizo is only used 7 times in 6 verses in the entire New Testament, and horizo is only used 8 times in 8 verses in the New Testament. If the concept of predestination was as major of an issue as Calvinists like to make it, where it seems to be the central theme of their entire identity, then the term translated predestinated surely should have been used in more than just 6 verses in the Bible. Now, of course, there are other terms that are used for those concepts as well, but that's the principal term. As I said, there are several other Greek terms that are used for this type of foreordination that we do need to properly understand. One is the word protithemi, P-R-O-T-I-T-H-E-M-I. That's the Greek expression meaning to appoint before. Or maybe if we want to say it like we would say it, to appoint beforehand, or to set in place beforehand. It's a combination of this word pro, which again means before, and tithemi, which means to place or to appoint or to ordain something. So it means someone that was placed or appointed or ordained before, in the past. Another word is eklegomai, E-K-L-E-G-O-M-A-I. That word means to take out or to lay out something for a purpose, as in the taking of a tool out of a toolbox in order to use it. It essentially just means to select something. As I said, I'm just going to go through these words quickly, but these are going to be very important words for you to know because these are the words that are behind some of the statements in the New Testament that Calvinists claim are talking about individual predestination to salvation or damnation. One other Greek word that we'll briefly examine is the Greek word tasso, T-A-S-S-O. It means to appoint or ordain. Now you notice, like in eklegomai or tasso for that matter, those type of words, talking about something being taken out or laid out or appointed or ordained, wouldn't necessarily have to mean it's been done far in the past. Sometimes when they're used in the Bible, they're just talking about the fact that they appointed someone right there in that moment. It isn't that they had been appointed from eternity past. And the same with taking or laying something out. You can take something out of the toolbox, so to speak, right at the moment you want to have the tool. It doesn't mean you took it out thousands of years ago. But we are going to have to look at the examples of those words to find out if there are statements that use them that seem to imply God chose a person out of the population of mankind long before that person was born. There's certainly examples of that. But the question is, are they examples of God choosing someone to be guaranteed to be saved or guaranteed to be destroyed ahead of time, or is it God choosing someone for a purpose? And then in passages where it looks like he's choosing people, is it individual people he's talking about or the corporate group? So those are things we're going to have to consider when we get into our next study. We will come back to the different Hebrew words that might have parallels with these terms for ordination or foreordination. But it's important to note that Hebrew does not have a direct equivalent to the Greek word proorizo, the Greek word translated predestinate. The Hebrew has a variety of verbs that can be used for choosing or appointing or determining something, which may or may not refer to doing so in some far distant past. As always, context is the key to determining whether or not that's the case. But it is interesting that Hebrew doesn't have a perfectly equivalent term with proorizo. Without a doubt, there are examples of God preordaining things in the Old Testament. It's interesting that there's not exactly a word for predestinated in the Old Testament. Not in a way that it is equivalent to the meaning of the Greek word. So, it was necessary for us to first go through some of these Greek terms that are used for predestination or foreordination, or for that matter, just used for appointing or ordaining someone, selecting them for some purpose or place, which, as I said, may not always be something that occurred in the past. It may just be an ordination occurring in the present. We do want to make sure that we get all the verses that refer to these ideas. In order to do that, we have to, as I said, look for the terms in the original language that refer to these concepts because they may not always be translated as predestinated or some other similar word, and so we might miss that that's what they're referring to. All that behind us, because I know some people are going to say it's all Greek to me, and they aren't interested in learning the Greek. In the next part of this study, we're going to look at the key passages in the New Testament that use those terms for ordination or foreordination, or predestination. And as we do so, you're going to want to have the chart that we put out in the last study close at hand so that you can look at the various types of predestination and foreordination that we noted that are definitely in the Bible in order to determine which type is being referred to in each passage. And for the sake of fairness, I would advise you to look and see if the passage looks like it fits better with one of those types, or if you think it actually does present the idea of individual predestination. And as always with any of these studies, you can send me questions. If you have a rebuttal of something I'm saying, I'm happy to receive it. And if I see it in time and am able to work in a response, I'll respond to it. The best way to do that is by going to our Substack page where our written materials are at, because there you can send me a direct message or you can comment directly on the posts. As is going to be the case with a lot of these studies on predestination, as I explained earlier, in part so as not to cause undue offense with those who might hold some of the positions I'm going to be challenging, as well as because some of what we're going to get into is going to be very firm in its statements. And again, I don't want to come across as, God forbid, condescending or cutting in any way any of the statements I'm making. We will not have all of these studies available publicly. The fuller versions of these studies are almost always going to be found on the Substack page where there's written material. For example, what we're calling episode 0, if you want to call it that, or session 0, or class 0, or whatever you may refer to it as, is actually kind of a prelude to the subject of predestination. And then this now is the third session. Well, that 0 session, which as I said is kind of a prelude, is a preliminary session. We went into quite a bit more detail in the written material than we went here on the podcast. In order to access that extra material on some of these studies, you do need to either be a member of the churches I'm working with, or you need to be a minister, or you need to be a supporting subscriber of the Substack page by subscribing to it and supporting it, which anyone is freely available to do. But I imagine most people are not going to do that unless they're very serious about the subject. Most of the time, when people invest something material in something, it's not just for the sake of controversy, it's because they truly do have an interest in it. So, next time we'll talk about the handful of passages in the Bible where proorizo is found, and we're going to look and find out in those passages translated predestinated, or some other form of that word, is it talking about individual people being predestinated to salvation or damnation? As I keep repeating, forgive me, I'm going to continue repeating it like that so that I know everybody understands what I'm talking about. Or is it talking about other forms of predestination?